Yes, I did talk to you a little bit about that story last week, which I think shows you a little bit about my process. I don't read ahead, not very well. I was surprised when I opened the lectionary last Monday and realized, oh, yeah, okay, great, we get to talk about Lazarus and the rich man. So there's this young couple that are going to get married. And they're driving on their wedding day, and I know traditionally you're not supposed to see one another on the day of your wedding, but this is a rather non-traditional couple driving to the church to get married, and they are hit by a train and killed. I know, right? And they go to heaven, and St. Peter meets them at the gate. And St. Peter says, welcome to paradise. This is a place where everything you've ever imagined can happen. Everything beautiful and good is here. Enjoy yourselves forever. And they stand at the gate, and Peter says, well, come on in. What's wrong? And they said, well, look, you know we were on our way to get married when we were hit by that train. And we were just wondering if we could still get married in heaven. And Peter says, I'm not sure. Let me find out. So Peter leaves, and Peter's gone for quite a while. Finally, he comes back and says, come into my office. So they go into his office and they sit down, and Peter says, well, it turns out, yes, you can. And he does this. He pulls his fingers and leans across the desk. You can get married in heaven. And they look at one another, and finally one of them says, well, listen, while you were gone, we were talking, like, this is a long time. We're going to be here. So we're not sure. I mean, what if, suppose we stop, like we don't love each other anymore. Is it possible, like if we wanted to, can we get divorced in heaven? And Peter says, it took me 4 days to find a pastor here. How long do you think it's going to take me to find a lawyer? Amen. I'm going to sit down. I think that those kind of jokes tell you absolutely nothing about the nature of the afterlife and more about the nature of life, right? It tells you more by what it doesn't say than by what it says. Look at Steve. Because we know that pastors and lawyers are not to be trusted. Am I right? They're not good people. They shouldn't be in paradise. Amen? They're not good people. They're in the wrong place. Those kinds of jokes.
Some good ones.
Well, they found one in the joke, right?
In one of those two categories.
One of one, right? It's going to take a minute to find a lawyer. Liar? And you were married to both, so I mean, bad news.
Oh, we'll find on that.
So you got this great story, right? This story that is not supposed to tell you something about the afterlife. It's supposed to do what the jokes do and tell you something about the realities of the life that we live today. So you have this very wealthy person who, here are the details Jesus gives you. Dressed in purple, feasts sumptuously, and outside the gate there is a person named Lazarus. The only person, as I told you last week, the only person in a parable of Jesus who has a name. I was going to tell you this later, but I'm going to tell you now so you can keep it in the back of your head. There's a theory that the rich man is an historical character, is based on Annas, the high priest, who had 5 brothers, who, because of his job, dressed in purple, because of his job, was very powerful, and because of his job, was able to neglect and ignore the poor. So Jesus is telling you a secret story about a real person. I was going to tell you another joke about the smartest man in the world, Donald Trump, and a dentist on an airplane. They're crashing, but I'm not going to tell you that joke. Well, we do tell jokes. We do tell stories about real people, and they just serve as kind of an icon of what we really want to talk about. But they die, and the details that Jesus gives are also kind of fun because the Lazarus, whose name is probably from this Aramaic name, Eleazar, which means God helps. And if you read the story, God does not help This person lives in the gutter and dies in the gutter. But he dies, and he is carried by angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and he was buried. Those details are kind of juicy, aren't they? They mean something. And there's this great reversal. They don't have the things that they had in life. Things are very different. And there's no redemption possible. It's over. It's done. Come and rescue me. No, you're stuck there. There is fixed between us this great chasm. I don't like that story. I like, have you ever read The Great Divorce? It's a thin little book by C.S. Lewis. Well, it's well written. It's easy to read. It starts off in this gray, dismal, drizzly suburban neighborhood where the houses stretch out forever and ever, amen, to the horizon. This is hell. It's not awful. It's just not great. It kind of reminds me of the TV show The Good Place, where people are tormented by living in a neighborhood where there are a lot of frozen yogurt shops, but no ice cream shops. I mean, it's okay, but it ain't ice cream, right? And the idea is, you think it's fine, but you know there's just something not quite right. So a bus pulls up in hell, and the driver says, hey, anyone want to go on a field trip? And the narrator thinks, well, what the hell? There's nothing happening here. Because, they're in hell. So off they go. They get on the bus and they drive across this great chasm, up this cliff, and they land in this place. And it turns out that this is the foothills of heaven. And they get off the bus, and the light is so strong, it's so real, and it feels like hammers. And the grass is like knives on their feet. And many of them rush back into the bus because they're just phantoms. They're not real. But the people who are hanging out outside the bus say, hey, look, if you stay here, this pain will turn to pleasure, and your phantom nature will become solid and real, and we'll go to this mountain, this beautiful place. And some of them decide to stick around, and bit by bit they become more solid, they become more real. Redemption kind of comes in fits and starts. It's a pretty fun story. I would highly recommend reading it. So off they go. I prefer that. The rich man finds himself in Hades. And he and Lazarus have come through the same experience of living and dying, and now everything's been reversed, and there is no further congress between the two. But that's the reality that first century people lived in, isn't it? You are fixed. You are stuck where you are. If you're a peasant, you're a peasant. If you've moved, your family has somehow moved to the tiny sliver of middle class, that's where you're going to be. There's not a lot of opportunity for social mobility. It's not like the myth of America where we are rags to riches all the time. And truthfully, we only move about 2 clicks one way or the other in our socioeconomic status. Where you're born is where you'll die, even in America. But we have this myth of the land of opportunity, right? Here's one of my favorite American preachers, Bruce Springsteen. There's diamonds in the sidewalk, the gutters lined in song, dear I hear the beer flows through the faucets all night long. There's treasure for the taking for any hardworking man who will make his home in the American land. The McNichols, the Posalskis, the Smiths, the Zarellis too, the blacks, the Irish, Italians, the Germans, and the Jews, they come across the waters 1,000 miles from home, with nothing in their bellies but the fire down below. They died building the railroads, they worked to bone and skin, they died in fields and factories, names scattered to the wind. They died to get here 100 years ago, they're still dying now. The hands that built the country, we're always trying to keep out. Ha! And a good preacher would say, America dressed in purple. America dying in the gutter. A good preacher would make this connection and say, between us and the rest of the world, there is fixed this great chasm. We, the last empire that the world may ever see, we exist as the rich man. And we exist as Lazarus in both ways. A good preacher might make that point. I wish we had one here who could make that point for us. It makes a lot of sense. John Chrysostom, this 5th century Christian writer, said that the rich man isn't in Hades because he's rich. He's there because he isn't merciful. And there's a part of me that wishes that were absolutely true. It's the same kind of impulse that I think that makes poor conservative people support tax breaks for the wealthy, tax breaks for corporations, because we think maybe sometime we might actually get there. I recognize that globally I'm dressed in purple. I recognize that historically you and I are dressed in purple, that you and I eat all we want, that you and I are the rich man. And we don't want to center the rich man. The center of the story here isn't the rich man, it's Lazarus, even though he has no lines. He's still the center of the story because he gets a name, because his existence matters. But I wish that it was simply because he wasn't merciful. But the story doesn't say that. The story says there is a wealthy person and there is a poor person. This is not a virtuous poor person. This isn't a good poor person. This isn't the kind of person who deserves mercy. This is just a person who is destitute. This is just a person who is wealthy. And wealth leads to a kind of indifference. A kind of indifference which is much more cruel, it seems, than active injustice. The rich man wasn't walking on Lazarus. He was walking past him. Lazarus didn't matter. That's where those things fall out. Even John Calvin, who, weirdo. Even John Calvin recognizes and calls this monstrous. It is monstrous that dogs have to do the work of human beings in this story. That dogs have to do the work of mercy and compassion because everyone else is indifferent to what's going on. So the rich man and Lazarus experience a radical redistribution of wealth. Can we say that? Can we say that? They experience this radical redistribution of wealth, not just fortune, luck, but wealth as well. What they have is switched. What they have turns upside down. And most American Christians would say, that ain't fair, right? Why should I have to take care of you? Why should my stuff be taken away from me so that you can have what you need to survive? Most American Christians would say that. Why should my hard work go to pay for your student debt, for your medical debt? Why should my hard work go to pay for families who don't have what I have? And don't get me started on immigrants, right? Aliens. The Bible talks a lot about aliens and immigrants, and always says, guess what? Take care of aliens who find themselves in your land. Take care of aliens that find themselves within your gates. Treat them like you would treat your own family. American Christians do that. Who does Jesus think he is, though? Who does Jesus think he is judging this rich man who was just doing his thing? He wasn't doing anything wrong. He just had stuff. It's not his fault that Lazarus doesn't have anything. But Jesus is kind of envisioning this world where my wealth becomes your wealth, where your suffering becomes my suffering, where there is this reversal of fortune over and over again. And this isn't an unusual thing. 100 years ago, many socialists were also rather theologically conservative Christians. The social gospel movement was started by people like Walter Rauschenbusch, who had this deep personal piety. Rauschenbusch started this organization to help fellow clergy really get serious about their personal faith, and at the same time realized the world is not the picture that Jesus painted for us. This world does not look like it should. And so started all kinds of organizations to help care for the poor and to change the structures of the world, not just to give generosity and mercy, but to shift the structures of society so that they might look a little more Christian. You know the phrase, what would Jesus do? WWJD. About 25 years ago, I was doing some youth group thing, and this maybe 12-year-old girl, she was very small, she goes, WWJD, who would Jesus date? WWJ, my mom told me she met a kid one time, many years ago, who thought it was www. JD. Some kind of website.
As a lawyer.
What would Jesus do comes out of the social gospel movement. It is not about who would Jesus date or who wouldn't Jesus date. What TV shows would Jesus not watch? What would Jesus refuse to do because Jesus is a prude? It is what would Jesus do in light of the suffering he sees around him. That's the point of that phrase. It isn't just to put on bracelets. It isn't just to make kids at camp feel bad about themselves. It is in order to restructure the world. But even despite all that, despite the fact that this rich man sees his fortune reversed, he doesn't change anything. Listen to what he says. He goes, Father Abraham, send Lazarus over here with some water to cool me, right? I am still on top. I may be burning in this horrible place, but I want Lazarus to be my servant. I want him to bring me some water. Not, hey, can I come over there? You think I can come over there? No. Send Lazarus, who I have oppressed his whole life, so he can serve me. And Abraham says, dude, we got this chasm. We can't hike this side, don't we? Well, I'll tell you what. Why don't you send Lazarus to my brothers, my 5 brothers? And it doesn't happen. It can't happen. The brothers aren't going to listen to a reanimated corpse. They're not going to listen to a resurrected Son of God. They're not going to listen to Jacob Marley shaking his chains at night and warning them of what they're doing, whispering their names in the darkness. That's not going to happen. They're not going to believe that. They're not going to buy into it. They've got Moses and the prophets, after all. They should already know. Jesus stands in the middle of this wisdom tradition that says the most important thing in the world is to love your neighbor. Because that looks like loving your God. Those two things are not distinguishable. Jesus stands in that tradition with all the rabbis that come before him, with the rabbis that come after him, and with this religion that comes in his name. But no one seems to really buy that. If they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they're not going to be convinced even if someone rises from the dead. So one of the arguments I hear against religion is this: we don't need God in order to be good. We don't need God to tell us not to murder people. We don't need God to tell us not to rape people. We don't need God to tell us to make sure everyone has enough to eat. We can do that on our own. There are plenty of books with titles along these lines, Good Without God. Yes, we can absolutely be good without God. But we're not. We're not good with God, and we're not good without God. It doesn't really seem to matter. Sometimes we do the right thing without God. Sometimes we do the right thing motivated by this faith in God. But often we choose the lesser good, and we choose the good for ourselves and less for others. And it's fascinating to me that recently very conservative Christians have found common cause with atheist or agnostic conservatives who have nothing good to say about their religion, but are still culturally chauvinistic enough that they seem to connect with each other. And that might sound a little too direct and too political, but remember, Jesus is probably talking about a real person that he's insulting here. Jesus is in this tradition that planted seeds. It doesn't plant trees, but it plants the seeds of valuing women, of valuing orphans, of valuing immigrants, not using immigrants in some kind of political stunt, not packing them onto planes and shipping them off just to own the libs. And if you think that's a good thing, let's not hear about your Christianity. Let's not pretend like you follow the crucified Christ. Let's not pretend like that's part of your reality. Now, sociologically speaking, yes, you call yourself whatever you want. But if those of us who stand within the wisdom tradition that Jesus stands within can easily say, I don't think that fits. That ain't part of what we're about. We are about caring for widows and orphans and aliens. We are about being with the oppressed. We are about solidarity with the oppressed. So last week I talked to a fellow clergy person who told me this story about going to a clergy retreat where a person of color presented lots of racial justice stuff. And she said afterwards, everyone there, these are all nice, white, woke clergy people who probably changed their Facebook profile to a black square back in 2020 because that was the cool thing to do because you're down with the cause. They probably had the yard signs, all of that stuff. They pushed back. They were quite threatened by the real idea of white fragility and responsibility and doing what we can to mitigate suffering. It was very painful and hard for them to hear. And the person who was facilitating this, she said, was really good about it. Was really patient and nice and kind. I'll tell you, let's finish that in a minute, but in the spring of 2021, you remember the Dr. Seuss, what do you call it? The Trust decided to get rid of a few books that Dr. Seuss had illustrated because they were incredibly racist, like painfully racist. So the daughter of a friend of mine from high school put this on Facebook. And because, I'm a middle-aged white man, I feel like the world needs to hear my opinion because I don't think we've heard enough from people who look like me and are socially situated like me. I decided I would go ahead and rank those images from most offensive, egregious racism to like, oh, I think this just looks like a caricature of an Asian kid. And an Asian American young person told me I was wrong. And because of all my aforementioned qualifiers, I decided to tell her, no, I think you're wrong. I think you should explain to me why this is offensive. And after just a very brief exchange, she told me where I could go and what I could do to myself when I got there. And I wanted to tell her, no, I'm on your team, right? I'm woke. I'm down with the cause. I've got yard signs. I'm part of this. You don't understand. But thank God she blocked me so I couldn't tell her all those things. I couldn't defend myself. And I'm really glad. I'm not glad that I hurt this person. I'm glad that this person hurt me. I'm glad that this person reversed the roles and put herself in Abraham's bosom and put me in Hades. And there is this great chasm called being blocked on Facebook that we cannot cross. And I cannot hope to raise her from the dead and return to this racism and misogyny so that I or someone who is very much like me could destroy her again. She didn't need to rise from the dead. If they don't listen to Moses, they're not going to listen to someone who rises from the dead. And it isn't Lazarus' work. It isn't the work of this person of color who led that clergy retreat. It isn't their job to carry the weight, to bear the burden of convincing you and me and people who look and are socially situated like we are, that we ought to be a little less indifferent, that we ought to pay attention, that we ought to not walk over those people who sit at the gate. It isn't the job of the oppressed to make the oppressors comfortable. But we ask that all the time, over and over again. And I'm really grateful for people like this young woman who, again, said some things to me that I don't think you should say out loud, and I've said to other people, but she said it in a way that it turned everything around. Parables, I think, can create new worlds, can create new possibilities, and I think Christians can bring those worlds into being. And I don't mean this to say, let's identify as individuals with Lazarus, let's identify as individuals with the rich man. I'm not saying that you should stop and give money to the folks who are hanging out outside City Market by the parking lot, because you should. That should go without saying. You should stop and hand those people whatever you've got in your pocket. Give that to those people. I'm not saying that we as a church should do better and get more City Market gift cards and maybe open up our building to other people. We should. That goes without saying. What I'm saying is I hope that this parable provokes us to deeper work, to deeper internal work, but also to the actual work of the redistribution of wealth Wealth not just money, but wealth in terms of power, wealth in terms of prestige, wealth in terms of social positioning, that we might work to create a world that looks very different from the world that we have inherited, and a world that looks very much more like the world that Jesus envisions. Amen?
Amen.
All right, amen.